Sunrise broke over Bramble Farm in pink and gold the morning Roy lost his voice, and somewhere out past the fence line, in the long wet grass of the river meadow, a small calf had already wandered the wrong way. Roy did not know about the calf yet. He did not know about the storm that was rolling down out of the hills either. He only knew that he had opened his beak at the top of the fence post the way he had opened it every morning for 9 years, and that nothing at all had come out. Roy was a well-summer rooster in the prime of his life. He was 9 summers old, which is a comfortable middle age for a rooster of his breed, and he was, as he would have told you himself if you spoke chicken, the proudest morning belle in the county. His feathers were the color of deep autumn, copper across the shoulders, oil black down the tail, a small white streak on the breast that he was very particular about keeping clean. He stood every morning on the same fence post at the corner of the chicken yard, the one Walt had set 10 years ago, and which had a flat top because Walt had laid a bit of slate on it the day Roy was born, just so the rooster would have a proper podium. Roy considered the slate his stage. He had crowed from it on the morning of his very first sunrise as a young cockerel, and he had crowed from it every morning since, in fair weather and in fog, and once, memorably, in a snowstorm so thick that he had crowed at what he thought was the dawn and had turned out to be the headlights of Walt's truck coming down the lane. The farm worked on Roy's voice. The cows in the lower pasture knew that breakfast did not come until the third crow, and they would not begin to amble toward the milking shed before then, even if the sun was already up and the dew was already burning off. Hodge the border collie, who was old and sensible and had earned the right to be slow in the mornings, would not stretch out from his rug by the kitchen door until Roy had crowed twice, because Hodge was a dog of habit and the second crow was his cue. Walt himself, in the small sagging farmhouse at the top of the lane, kept his alarm clock unset for 9 years running, because Roy had never once let him down. The whole farm turned on Roy like a wheel turns on its axle, and Roy, who was vain in the small good way that strong, proud animals are vain, knew it and loved it, and never spoke a word about it. That morning, the morning that begins this story, Roy hopped up onto the slate just as he had every other morning of his life. He smelled rain in the high air, although the sky was still clear. He stretched his neck. He turned his head to face the east, where the first pink light was already touching the tops of the oaks at the river. He filled his small chest with as much air as a rooster of his breed can hold, and he opened his beak. Nothing came out. A little squeak came out, a small hiss of air, like a kettle thinking about boiling and then deciding against it. Roy blinked. He cleared his throat, or rather, he did the small ruffle and shake thing a rooster does, that is the chicken equivalent of clearing the throat, and tried again. A wheeze. A polite, embarrassed little wheeze, the kind of sound a much older rooster might make on a much colder morning. He stared down at his own chest as if the chest had betrayed him. He tried a third time. A cough. Across the chicken yard, the hens looked up. 3 of them tilted their heads in that slow chicken way that is the closest a chicken comes to a question. One of them, a buff Orpington named Mim, who had known Roy since he was a downy chick, made a small, worried clucking noise. Roy could not look at her. He turned his back on the yard and faced the rising sun and tried again, harder, and got for his trouble a sound rather like a tea kettle being knocked over with a broom. The sun rose anyway. The sun rose the way the sun always rises, with no opinion at all on whether anyone was crowing about it. The pink turned to gold. The gold spread across the upper pasture and rolled down the slope and lit up the windows of the farmhouse one by one, and the windows of the farmhouse stayed dark, because Walt, who had woken to Roy's voice for 9 years running, had not been woken this morning, and was sleeping the deep, peaceful sleep of a man who trusts his rooster. The cows in the lower pasture stayed lying down. Hodge by the kitchen door did not stretch. The whole farm slept on, and Roy stood on his little slate stage and made small mortified noises at the sky, and felt, for the first time he could remember, very small indeed. Roy did what any proud creature does when something he had always taken for granted suddenly will not work. He decided to fix it himself quietly before anyone else found out. He hopped down off the slate. He marched with as much dignity as a small, embarrassed rooster can muster across the yard to the water trough, and he dipped his beak into the cold rainwater Walt had left there yesterday afternoon. He gargled. He had never gargled before in his life, and he was not, it turned out, very good at it. He tried again. He held his head back, the way he had once seen Walt do at the kitchen sink, and let the cold water trickle down the back of his throat, and he opened his beak to test the result, and produced a sound exactly like a duck stepping on a frog. Speaking of ducks, Roy looked across the yard at the small brown pond where the 3 farm ducks lived, and he thought, with the desperate brightness of a creature who is running out of ideas, that ducks made all kinds of sounds, and surely one of them knew something about voices. He marched over. He stood at the edge of the pond. He inclined his head, the way one professional addresses another, and put the question to them in chicken. How does one get one's voice back if one has lost it? The ducks looked at him. "Quack," said the first duck kindly. "Quack," said the second duck, who was the practical one. "Quack, quack," said the third duck, who fancied herself a thinker. Roy thanked them politely and walked away. He did not blame the ducks. The ducks had given him exactly the answer they had to give. It was not their fault that his question had no answer in their language. He felt, walking back across the yard, the small hot prickle of a creature who has begun to realize that his problem is not going to solve itself before breakfast. The songbirds were next. The songbirds at Bramble Farm lived in the old apple tree behind the hen house, and they sang every morning at first light in a complicated overlapping chorus that Roy had always rather looked down on for being too fancy. Today he stood under their tree and listened with the close attention of a creature trying to learn a language he has been making fun of for years. He picked out one melody, a thin, clear 5-note tune from a small gray bird he could not name, and he tried to copy it. He opened his beak. He produced a sound. The sound was not a 5-note tune. It was a single low gargle, like a frog with a head cold. The gray bird stopped singing. The gray bird looked down at Roy. In the slow, careful way a small bird looks at a very large bird who is doing something concerning. And then the gray bird went back to singing as if Roy had not happened. The other songbirds, however, had heard. There was a small ripple of bright, birdie laughter through the apple branches, a sound Roy had heard before but had never, until that moment, understood was directed at anyone. He dropped his head and walked back across the yard with his tail feathers very low to the ground. By mid-morning, the farm had started to notice. Walt, in the farmhouse, had eventually woken on his own, which was a thing he had not done in 9 years, and had stood at his kitchen window with a mug of coffee in his hand for a long minute before he had said out loud to no one in particular, "Where's the rooster?" Hodge by the door had made a small, worried woof. Walt had pulled on his boots and gone out to the chicken yard and found Roy standing very straight on the slate post with his back to the farmhouse and his head turned away. The picture of a creature pretending nothing was wrong. Walt had scratched his head. He had said, "You all right, old fella?" Roy had not turned around. Walt had stood there a moment longer, then gone off to deal with the cows, who were standing by the milking shed in a small, cross-looking line, 2 hours past their usual breakfast, and very much aware of it. Roy, when Walt had gone, had hopped down off the slate again, because he had decided on a new strategy. He had remembered from somewhere in the back of his rooster mind that Walt sometimes practiced singing in the kitchen by leaning his face into a tin pot, because the pot made his voice louder and rounder and easier on his own ears. Roy thought this was an excellent idea. He marched across the yard to the small dented tin bucket Walt had left by the hen house, and he stuck his head into it, and he tried very hard to crow. He produced into the bucket a small flat noise that the bucket then reflected back to him, magnified and metallic, so that it sounded exactly like a small flat noise echoing off a tin bucket. He tried again. He tried louder. He produced a sound rather like a kazoo being trodden on by a goat. Mim the buff Orpington came around the corner of the hen house just then and stopped and watched him for a moment with her head tilted and made a small clucking sound that was not, this time, mockery. It was the kindly clucking of an old friend who has watched a proud creature do something embarrassing. Roy pulled his head out of the bucket. He looked at Mim. Mim looked at Roy. Roy tried, with what shred of dignity he had left, to look as though he had been doing something else entirely, perhaps inspecting the inside of the bucket for slugs. Mim, who was kind, did not press the point. She made another small clucking sound, the chicken equivalent of, well, you'll figure it out, and went off to peck at the dust by the hen house wall. The clouds began to come over the hill at midday. Roy noticed before anyone else did. He had been sitting on the hen house roof, sulking, with his back to the farmyard and his tail feathers drooping, when he had felt the first cool change in the air, that quick smell of metal and wet grass that well-summer roosters can smell long before any human can, because their breed comes from a low country where weather is everything. He turned. He saw the line of gray along the top of the hills to the west, and he saw the way the swallows had gone low across the upper pasture, and he saw, with a small, quick chill of recognition, that the storm was going to be on the farm in less than an hour. He looked down at the yard. Walt was in the milking shed. Hodge was on the porch. The cows were back at their grazing in the lower pasture, calm and content, with no idea anything was coming. And down at the far end of the lower pasture, where the fence ran alongside the road and turned to follow the river, Roy saw something that made his small heart go cold. The fence had a gap in it, a small one, where a rotten post had finally tipped sideways in the night, and through the gap, with the slow, curious wandering of a creature who has decided the grass really might be greener on the other side of the road, was the smallest calf on Bramble Farm. Her name was Pip. She was 3 weeks old. She was a small white Hereford with a brown patch shaped like a very lopsided heart over her left eye, and she was Walt's particular favorite, and she was, at this moment, walking down the gravel shoulder of the river road in the direction of the river meadow. And the river meadow was where, in any heavy rain, the river came up over the bank and made a wide, cold flat of mud and water that a small calf could very easily get stuck in. Roy did not think. He opened his beak on top of the hen house roof and tried, with everything he had, to crow. Nothing. He tried again. He tried a third time. He stretched his small chest until his ribs hurt, and he forced the air up through his throat, and he produced the smallest possible scratchy whisper of a sound, like a saw being drawn very slowly across a piece of dry wood. It was a sound a barn cat would not have heard from across the yard, never mind a man in a milking shed. The cows in the lower pasture went on grazing. Walt went on milking. Pip went on walking, slow and curious, down the road toward the river. Roy did the only thing he could think of. He launched himself off the hen house roof. A well-summer rooster is not built for distance. He can flap up onto a low fence, and he can flap down off a high one, and in between he can manage a sort of clumsy swooping glide, with his wings going full tilt and his feet pedaling at the air, that gets him across maybe 20 yards if the wind is with him. Roy had never tried for the porch from the hen house roof in his life. The distance was nearer 50 yards, and the porch had a rail along the front of it. And the rail had on it the brass dinner bell that Walt's grandfather had hung there in 1957, with its rope dangling down, and the bell that was rung only on 3 occasions: dinner, a calving, and an emergency. Roy went off the hen house roof like a dropped sack. He flapped. He flapped harder. He felt himself dipping, and he felt himself begin to glide, and he felt, with the small, clear focus of a creature whose pride had been beaten out of him by a morning of failure, that he had exactly one chance to get this right, and that he was not, this time, going to waste it on being embarrassed. He cleared the cow gate. He cleared the wood pile. He cleared the geraniums in the planter by the porch step, and he came in low and crooked and graceless, and landed, with a small thump of feathers, on the porch rail right beside the bell. He grabbed the rope in his beak. The rope was thicker than he was used to, and it tasted of old hemp and rain. He yanked. The bell, 8 feet above him, swung once and gave a loud, clear clang, and the clang went out across the yard like a thrown stone across still water. He yanked again, clang. He yanked a third time, and a fourth, and he found a rhythm, clang, 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 and he kept at it, and the bell kept at it with him, and the sound rolled across the yard and into the milking shed and up toward the road. Hodge came tearing off the porch first, because Hodge had been right there, and Hodge knew the bell. Then Walt came out of the milking shed at a dead run, with milk on his hands, because he had heard the bell from inside and had counted the rings, 4, 5, 6, and had known at the third one that it was not dinner and not a calving, but the third thing, the one Walt's grandfather had hung the bell for in 1957, and that Walt had heard rung exactly twice in his life. He saw the rooster on the porch rail. He saw the rope in the rooster's beak. He stopped for half a second on the path. Then he saw, over Roy's shoulder, the gap in the fence and the small white shape on the road, and he ran. The rain came as Walt reached the road. It came the way a summer storm in this country always comes, all at once, like a tipped bucket, in long, cold ropes that hissed off the gravel and turned the dust to mud in a single breath. Pip was already past the bend by then, a small, wet white shape in the long grass at the edge of the river meadow, with her ears down against the rain and her small heart beating fast because she had begun, just begun, to understand that she did not know the way home. Walt did not call to her. Walt knew calves. He slowed to a walk as he came around the bend, and he came at her low and quiet from the roadside, and Hodge, who had been a working dog his whole life, and who knew this work in his bones even at 12 years old, slipped through the long grass behind her and came up on her riverside, so that when Pip looked up and saw them, she saw Walt in front of her, and Hodge between her and the water, and there was only one direction left for a small calf to go, which was toward Walt's outstretched hand. Walt picked her up. He picked her up the way a man picks up a thing he has been afraid he had lost, with both arms under her wet body and his face turned down into her wet neck, and he stood there in the rain for one long moment before he turned and started back up the road. Hodge fell in behind him, soaked through, his old hips slow, but his old eyes bright. The rain came down. The bell up at the farmhouse had stopped ringing. By the time Walt came around the bend with the calf in his arms and the dog at his heel, Roy was off the porch rail and back on the slate post at the corner of the chicken yard, watching, very still, with his tail feathers held in close to his body, as a small, proud creature does when the thing it has done has been too big to brag about. Walt carried Pip into the barn. He laid her down in the dry straw in the corner stall, the warm one nearest the cow gate, and he rubbed her down with a clean burlap sack until the shaking stopped, and he went and got her mother in from the lower pasture and set the two of them up nose to nose in the warm straw, and he stood in the doorway of the barn for a long minute, watching the small white calf nurse, and he said softly, mostly to himself, "Oh, you scared me." Then he turned and walked back across the yard in the rain, and he did not stop at the porch, and he did not stop at the kitchen, and he did not stop until he was at the corner of the chicken yard, where Roy was standing on his slate. Walt looked up at the rooster. The rooster looked down at the man. The rain ran off Walt's hat and off Roy's tail feathers, and neither of them said anything, in the way that two old creatures of the same farm sometimes have nothing to say to each other and have everything to say at once. "Reckon I owe you one, old fella," Walt said. Roy, of course, could not answer. He could not have answered even if he had had his voice, because Rooster does not translate easily into man, and certainly not into a sentence as careful as that one. But he held Walt's eyes, and he gave the smallest possible dip of his copper head, the chicken equivalent of "you are welcome," and Walt, who had been keeping chickens for 40 years and could read a rooster as easily as a newspaper, saw it and nodded back. By morning the storm had moved on east, leaving the world washed and bright and smelling of grass. Walt was up before dawn. He had set his alarm for the first time in 9 years, just to be safe, and he had slept badly for worry about Roy, which was a worry he had not expected to have. And he came out into the yard with a length of soft cord under his arm and a look on his face that Roy, watching from the slate post, recognized as the look of a man who had been working a problem in his sleep. Walt went to the porch. He took down the brass dinner bell from the rail. He carried it across the yard to the corner of the chicken yard where Roy's slate post stood, and he tied the bell very carefully to the side of the fence post just below the slate, with the rope coming up so that the end of it hung within easy reach of where Roy stood. He stepped back. He surveyed his work. He looked up at the rooster. "Now you've got 2, he said, "just in case." Roy considered the bell. He considered the rope. He had never thought of himself as a creature who needed a backup, but he had also, until yesterday, never thought of himself as a creature who could lose his voice. And the world this morning was a slightly different shape than the world had been the morning before, and Roy was, as well summer roosters go, a sensible bird. He hopped onto the slate. He took the rope gently in his beak. He gave it the smallest of tugs. Clang, said the bell, soft, friendly, polite. Roy was rather pleased with the sound. He let go of the rope. He turned to face the east, where the first pink line of dawn was just beginning to show over the oaks at the river. He filled his chest. He opened his beak. A small, dry, scratchy sound came out. It was nothing like the proud, full crow of yesterday morning, but it was, unmistakably, a crow. A tiny, rough cock-a-doodle, raspy as old paper, but a crow. Roy was so surprised he very nearly fell off the post. He tried again. The second crow was a little louder. The third was almost normal, only a touch hoarse, like a man with a cold who is on the mend. Roy stood up very straight on his slate. He pulled the bell rope once for good measure, clang, and he crowed again, and he crowed a 4th time, and by the time he was through the 5th time, the windows of the farmhouse were lit, and Walt was on the porch with his coffee in his hand, and Hodge was stretched out in the doorway with his nose on his paws, and the cows in the lower pasture had got to their feet and were ambling, in a contented line, toward the milking shed, 2 hours later than yesterday and not minding, because they had gone to bed knowing the day was going to start when the rooster said it was, and the rooster, this morning, was saying it was. Mim the Buff Orpington came out into the yard. She looked up at Roy on his slate with the bell beside him, and she made a small approving cluck, and she went off to peck at the dust by the henhouse wall as if all of this were perfectly ordinary, which, on a farm like Bramble Farm, in the kind of country where small calves wander and small roosters figure things out, perhaps it was.